The procession of the dead. Father Miguel had already heard many stories about the old small village cemetery where he served, situated at the top of a hill, surrounded by twisted trees and constantly wrapped by a dense fog. The place kept secrets that no one dared to reveal. Since he had reached the parish, the faithful murmured about strange events, but he always attributed it to the superstitions of an isolated village. However, everything changed in a rainy night, when Miguel saw something he could never forget. It was the eve of the Day of All, and the priest had been late in the church preparing the Mass. In closing the sacristy, he noticed an unusual movement on the dirt road that led to the cemetery. At first, he thought he was a group of faithful visiting his loved ones, but as figures approached, he realized that they were not ordinary pilgrims. Men and women wearing dark cloaks walked in absolute silence, holding candles whose flames did not travel with the wind. His faces were hidden under deep hoods, and their steps produced no sound even over the damp mud. Miguel's heart accelerated when he realized that despite the rain that punished the village, his clothes remained dry. Feeling a cold that didn't come from the night, the priest retreated into the church and locked the door. The silence outside was suffocating. He approached the window and, with a mixture of horror and fascination, saw the procession stop before the gates of the cemetery. One of the hooded people slowly lifted his arm, pointing to the church. At that moment, the candles that illuminated the altar went out alone. Tremendous. Miguel squeezed the crucifix hanging around his neck and began to pray aloud. The Latin of his prayer echoed through the stone walls, and the church seemed to shudder. Outside, he heard a sound that froze his blood, a deep murmur like dozens of voices whispering at the same time. Indecipherable words brushed their ears, promising secrets that should not be known. Then the church bell rang alone. 1, 2, 3 times. Miguel fell to his knees, feeling a presence approaching. Something was inside the church with him. When he finally gathered courage to turn around, he saw shadows dragging on the floor, as if the darkness came to life. His eyes tried to focus the figures, but they moved impossible, writing against the laws of reality. Between the whispers, he heard a name to be called repeatedly. Your name. The walls of the church began to crack, as if an invisible force were trying to enter. The glass of the stained glass snapped, forming small fissures that reflected distorted forms in human faces that observed on the other side. The smell of burnt candle and damp earth filled the air, and the priest felt like being pulled to another dimension. With a desperate effort, Miguel raised the sacred chalice and began a rite of exorcism. The church floor shaved and a scream cut the silence of the night. A lament of pain and anger echoed, making his own air vibrate. Outside, the bell sounded one last time, and then everything ceased. When the priest finally dared to look out the window again, the procession was gone. But on the muddy floor, a trail of footprints led from the cemetery to the church door. The next morning, when he went out to check out, Miguel found something that made his blood freeze. His own name, written in the wooden door, with shaking and faded lyrics, as if they had been carved centuries earlier. In the following days, Miguel tried to forget what happened, but the church bell never touched the same way. The chips seemed dragged, distorted, as if a lament echoed in each sound. Some faithful began to report strange dreams where they walked through an endless cemetery, surrounded by the same hooded figures. They always woke up with the feeling that someone watched them from the darkness. The night after the incident, Miguel woke up startled with a metallic sound from the interior of the church. Taking a lamp, walked to the main ship and froze to see the door ajar. A rusty chain shook alone, hanging at the entrance. The wind blew a distant song, and on the altar a black cloak folded over the crucifix. Something inside him said that it was not over. In the middle of the darkness of the church, he felt a cold presence behind him. He heard the sound of heavy breaths, as if something invisible surrounded him. Miguel held his crucifix harder, but felt his fingers numb, as if a cold energy traveled his body. He tried to run, but his feet were stuck to the floor, as if invisible hands held him. A shadow crawled down the walls, and for a moment he saw bright eyes watching him from darkness. Fear consumed it. Miguel shouted a desperate prayer, and suddenly a crash shook the church. The doors closed alone with a deafening impact. The next nights became a torment for the priest. Whenever he tried to sleep, a sound awakened him, slow steps dragging on the stone corridors. When he got up to check, he found nothing, just the unsettling echo that seemed to come from all sides at the same time. On the third night after the incident, Miguel found brands of hands on his table, as if someone had leaned over there. The marks were thin, almost translucent, but looked moist, leaving a wet earth smell in the air. He cleaned the marks, but the next night they reappeared, this time at the door of his room. The cold increased as the days passed, even with the fireplace on. One day Miguel realized that his cassock, stored inside the closet, was covered with ancient dust, as if it were not touched for centuries, but he used it daily. Since then, all the eve of the souls, the bell plays 3 times alone, and every time Miguel prays that the procession is no longer on the way. But deep down, he knows that there is no prayer that can stop those who walk between the living and the dead. And now, every night, before bed, he feels a presence at the foot of his bed. A hoarse whisper echoes in his ears. There is no escape. The procession marked him, and sooner or later Miguel knows he will have to follow them. The only question left is when. The call of the shallow grave. Father Samuel had been serving more than 20 years in the parish of Santa Helena, a centenary church located on the outskirts of a forgotten village for time. Surrounded by clenched forests and an old cemetery, the place was the scene of whispered stories among the faithful, reports of apparitions and voices that echoed between the tombstone at night. Samuel, an unshakable man of faith, always refuted these stories as the fruit of the superstitious imagination of the residents. But on a cold November night, something happened. Something that forever changed its conception of what was real and what should remain buried. It all started when an elderly woman appeared in the church, covered by a black cloak and her eyes full of silent despair. Trembling, she begged the priest to accompany her to the cemetery. He said that for 3 nights in a row, he had heard someone calling his name outside his house, a dragged voice, almost a lament, repeating his name as a macabre prayer. When he had the courage to look out the window, he saw only his fog crawling on the floor. But that night, he found marks on his damp land near his door, small hands like those of a child. Intrigued, but not wanting to feed the fear of the woman, Samuel decided to accompany her to the cemetery. The moon was hidden by thick clouds, and the cold wind blown through the dried trees, making them grinding like bones crackling under the earth. As they walked between the old headstones, the priest began to feel a weight in his chest, an invisible pressure that seemed to make the air denser. The elderly woman pointed to a point ahead, a small, nameless tomb, her revolving land, as if something had tried to get out of there. When Samuel approached, a weak sound broke the silence, a whisper coming from the underground. Low, almost a muffled sob. His eyes widened and his blood froze in his veins. The sound was repeated, this time more audible. "Father, help me." Samuel's heart shot. He backed up instinctively, but something inside him, a force beyond his understanding, made him kneel beside the grave. He touched the cold earth, and for a moment, everything was completely silent. The old woman grabbed her arm tightly, her pale and rigid face for fear. The whisper returned, now accompanied by a more disturbing sound, nails scratching wood. Something, or someone, was inside, trying to leave. And then the earth began to move. Samuel felt a shiver traveling his spine as a skeletal hand broke the surface, his twisted fingers and covered with dry skin. The elderly woman released a suffocated scream and retreated, stumbled on a tombstone. The priest, for a moment, was paralyzed, unable to look away from that hand that now tried to pull out. The smell of rot intensified, and a weak, sibilating voice escaped from the hole. "Why did you leave me here?" The story of that tomb had been forgotten for time, but now Samuel knew his owner had never really departed. And the worst, I wanted company. Samuel tried to get up, but felt something arrest his cassock. He looked down and saw cadaverous fingers holding the fabric with a huge force. The hand was cold, hard as stone, but there was a remnant of movement, an effort to pull it into the pit. The priest shouted, trying to get rid of, and the elderly woman began to pray in despair. The earth around began to sink like frowning sand, slowly sucking his hand down. But before it disappeared completely, something emerged from the hole, a cadaverous, back-looking, empty-eyed face that opened in a grotesque smile. The dry, darkened lips moved slowly, forming almost inaudible words. "Father, come with me." Samuel pulled the cassock with all his might, falling backwards. The elderly woman ran to him and helped him get up, his teary eyes of dread. The earth stirred again, and in an instant the hole closed as if it had never been touched. Panting, the priest held the crucifix against his chest and walked away from the pit. But something was wrong. The air seemed heavy, and an absolute silence reigned in the cemetery. Listening to his own hammering heart against his chest, Samuel took the elderly by the hand and ran toward the exit. Before crossing the gates, one last sound echoed through the cemetery, a low, cold laugh that seemed to come from all sides at the same time, the laugh of something that should not be there. In the following days, Samuel tried to find records about who could be buried in that pit. He searched ancient files, questioned the older residents, but there was no record of that grave. It was as if it had never existed. However, every night, before bed, he heard a low and insistent sound from the darkness of the church, the scratch of nails against wood. Since then, Samuel avoids the cemetery at dusk, but he knows it's just a matter of time. One day, the whispering voice will call it again, and next time, he may not be able to resist the shallow grave call. The man who never departed. Father Augustus was an unshakable man of faith. For over 40 years, he has dedicated his life to the small parish of St. Bartholomew, located in an isolated village surrounded by enavoid hills and an old cemetery. Time did not seem to pass in that place, and the moss-covered head chips told forgotten stories of people who lived and died for centuries. He had already seen a lot there. He saw the mourning becomes acceptance. He saw tears be spilled until the pain dissipated. But there was something in that cemetery he could never understand. Whenever he visited the place at night to make his prayers, he saw a man, dressed in black, dark hat, and with his hands crossed in front of his body, he remained motionless, staring at the same tombstone. At first, he thought it was just a devoted relative, someone who refused to accept the departure of a loved one. But over the years, something disturbing happened. Man never aged, never changed his posture, and never responded when he was called. Even more disturbing, he disappeared as soon as the priest tried to approach. One day, Augusto decided to end the mystery. He approached with caution, feeling his heart beat rapidly on his chest. The fog was crawling between the thick, dense and damp tombs, drowning the sound of their steps. When it was a few meters away, he called for the man. "My son, do you need help?" But the only answer was silence. The priest tried to extend his hand, but in the blink of an eye, the stranger broke into smoke before his eyes. The priest felt a shiver up the spine. He knew this was not normal. I needed to find out more. He searched the parish records, turned old forgotten files in the humid basement of the church, and finally found a name: Antonio Ferreira, deceased in 1892. The tombstone the man visited was his. But why did your soul still remain there? Antonio's story was tragic. According to reports of the time, he was found dead in mysterious circumstances. Some said it had been murdered, others who had taken his own life. The fact was that he had never received the right religious rites. The church at the time had refused to hold its funeral because of the rumors about its death, and so your spirit never found rest. Determined to release the tormented soul, Father Augusto decided to investigate further. He talked to old residents, heard whispers of forgotten stories, and found that on the night of Antonio's death, shouts were heard from the cemetery. A tall, disallowance shadow would have been seen wandering between the tombstone, disappearing when the first rays of sunshine appeared. In the following weeks, the priest began to perceive strange things in the parish. Objects changed places. The church bell played alone at 3 in the morning, and sometimes he woke up in the middle of the night, feeling a presence at the foot of his bed. One night, as he walked through the dark corridor of the church, he saw a motionless silhouette at the cemetery door. With his heart rapidly, he advanced slowly, but when he came close, the figure disappeared, leaving only a trail of intense cold. One day at dawn, one of the grave diggers of the village appeared terrified in the church. He told the priest that as he passed the cemetery before the sunrise, he saw fresh footprints on the damp earth around Antonio's grave, footprints of someone barefoot, as if it had come out of the pit itself. Augusto decided to investigate and, to his surprise, found the marks that led to the exit of the cemetery, but with no sign of who could have done them. Fear took over the village. The faithful began to avoid the cemetery at night, and even the grave diggers refused to work after sunset. The priest knew he needed to act fast. He organized a mass for Antonio, summoned the faithful, and prayed for his soul. But as soon as he began his prayers, a cold breeze crossed the church and all candles went out at the same time. Fear spread among those present, and Augustus knew that something powerful was reacting to his intervention. That night, he returned to the cemetery. He found the man again before the tombstone, but this time he looked different. His shoulders were no longer rigid, his gaze was no longer empty. The priest began to pray, and then, for the first time, the man turned to him. His eyes were deep and dark, like an endless well. A tear ran down his pale face, and he whispered something almost inaudible. "Thank you." The priest felt a knot in his throat. It was as if he had released a soul trapped for more than a century. But the sense of danger did not dissipate. When the man disappeared, the wind that blown through the cemetery became a sinister howl. A smell of moist and rotten earth took over the environment. Suddenly, he heard heavy steps behind him. Turning slowly, he felt a chill through his spine as he saw a new, louder, grotesque shadow hovering between the tombstone. The eyes of the figure shone like embers in the dark. A severe, prolonged whisper echoed through the cemetery, calling his name, dragged. The priest retreated, holding his crucifix tightly, murmuring prayers. In the following days, the events intensified. Steps were heard inside the empty church, doors beat alone, and a trail of muddy footprints appeared on the parish's stone floor every morning. The priest began to question whether he had released Antonio or unintentionally awakened something even worse. It was then that an old village resident revealed a dark secret. Antonio Ferreira was not just a victim of an unresolved crime, he had been accused of terrible acts in life. Many believed that he was involved with obscure practices that would have made a pact to escape death, but had failed. His soul had remained imprisoned, waiting for something, or someone. Since that night, the man in black has never seen again, but the cemetery has never been truly silent. The faithful say that on fog nights a whisper echoes through the wind, calling by the priest's name, and some, as they pass the tomb of Antonio Ferreira, feel a deep shiver, as if something was still there, watching, waiting. Others, however, claim that in the distance, between the tombstones, a shadow still surrounds, on the lurking of something or someone. The now older and debilitated priest still prays every night in his room. But sometimes, when walking through the dark corridors of the parish, he feels the cold wind, caresses his neck, and hears, in the distance, the whisper of a name he no longer wants to hear. On a rainy night, looking out the window, he saw a stopped silhouette next to the church. The same rigid posture, the same fixed look. Antonio Ferreira never left, and maybe it will never leave. Perhaps the next imprisoned soul is his.